This conference will now be recorded.
Pratt Housing Consortium Decarbonization Symposium. Fatou, Jabbie, and I will be your co-moderators today. On Earth Day 2022, our Decarbonization Symposium will offer a deep dive into the challenges and opportunities decarbonizing the built environment, with a special focus on efforts to reduce embodied and operational carbon emissions in New York City. Our symposium will consist of welcome remarks, 5 panelist presentations, followed by a moderated panel discussion and a Q&A open to the audience. We will have a 5-minute break after the third presentation. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Pratt Institute and the School of Architecture for supporting the symposium, and to the Decarbonization Working Group, especially Francis Huppert, for their efforts in organizing this event with me. We are so grateful to SOA's event coordinator, Courtney Knapp, for her tireless support. Please take note of the protocol for earning AICP or AIA continuing education credits on this next slide.
Thanks so much, Meta. Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Knapp. I'm an associate professor in the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment in the School of Architecture at Pratt. I'm also the events coordinator for the School of Architecture this semester, and just really excited to be able to, say that we can offer both AIA and AICP continuing education credits for this event. We can, if you are a certified planner, AICP certified planner, you are eligible for 2.5 credits, and if you are, I guess, a licensed architect and are looking for either land use or health and, I guess it's welfare credits, we can offer 2 of those. So there are basically 2 links for each group that I'll be sending out in the chat over the course of this event. The first is just a sign-up sheet. So if you are either seeking AICP or AIA credits, I need to essentially get your name and your AIA number or your APA number. That's one thing that I need to turn over to those organizations. Towards the end of the event, I'll also be sending out evaluation forms for both of those organizations, and they're very short. They should only take a minute or 2, but it would be most helpful if you would be willing to do that at the end as well. So it's a way that they also can kind of track who is participating. So that would be great. And if you have any questions, you can send me a message in the chat or email me. I will add my email to the chat, but otherwise just look for the links. I'll be sharing them throughout this event. And thanks again, and welcome.
To start the symposium, Pratt Institute's President Francis Bronet will offer a welcome and share a few remarks. Let me introduce President Bronet. Francis Bronet is the president of Pratt Institute in New York City, an educator and leader at the forefront of interdisciplinary learning. Bronet previously served as senior vice president and provost at Illinois Institute of Technology, acting provost and dean at the School of Architecture and Allied Arts at the University of Oregon, and architecture professor, associate dean, and acting dean at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Francis Bronet, please start your remarks. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. I can.
Okay. Well, thank you. Welcome, everyone, once again. How honored we are here to have this incredibly distinguished panel and guests. As a president, as an architect and engineer, as someone who taught materials and structures, who taught embodied energy, as a parent and as a citizen, I want to thank you for your amazing work. On Earth Day and every day, I am very proud of Pratt's community's development commitment to sustainability. In so many ways, you're actively working to integrate sustainability into our academic programs and to lower the Institute's carbon footprint, if not our pedagogical carbon footprint. Well, let me give you a few examples. Since 2007, which I can't believe is actually 15 years, Pratt Sustainability Center has been the hub for Pratt's commitment to educate environmentally responsible citizens. In 2016, the center developed a program for departmental sustainability coordinators that provides faculty stipends to support new initiatives within existing programs. Currently, 13 departments participate, and in just 3 years, there's been a 55% increase in courses related to sustainability. Pratt's Facilities Management Office has also been working to decarbonize our campus, pursuing a host of strategies to meet New York City's aggressive carbon reduction mandates. Some of us would say perhaps not aggressive enough. And because of these, I would say, initial good efforts, Pratt has been awarded silver stars, and you're going to push us for much higher ratings by the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. It's actually the highest rating of any independent art and design school in the United States. So these efforts are right in line with Pratt's strategic plan and institutional learning goals, and with the values and intentions of our students whose futures depend on them. Since 2005, Pratt Sustainability Coalition, which is a cross-disciplinary group of students, faculty, staff, it's worked to support Pratt's sustainability efforts, including what we're in right now, of course, the Spring Pratt Earth Action Week with over 20 events, the student-led initiative with AVI Fresh to ban single-use plastic water bottles, and the Give Take Art Supply Recycling Initiative coordinated with Pratt's Facilities Office to ensure that supplies that would otherwise be just thrown out and discarded get to students who need them. 55,000 pounds of materials have been recovered and redistributed since the program's launch in the fall of 2016. We know there's so much being done and so much for us to do. I have to say, we look forward to the expansive thinking and proposals this event will bring. I want to thank you all for your commitment to decarbonization. Have an amazing symposium. We look forward to it. Take care. Back to you, Meta.
Thank you, Francis. I'd like to now introduce David Burney, the chair of the Pratt School of Architecture Housing Consortium. David, take it away.
Hey. Thank you, Meta, and happy Earth Day, everybody. There's a bit of a racket in the background. It's my dog. I apologize for that, but I would try to keep him quiet. So just a little bit of background on the Decarbonization Symposium. The School of Architecture Housing Consortium was formed in 2019, which seems like an eon ago now. And the idea had been that within the school, we have a great deal of expertise, both in housing design and housing policy, and that if we could bring everybody together, we could establish a pretty powerful think tank on those topics. And we also brought in, over time, other experts from outside. And we set about addressing some of the major issues on the issue of housing. First of course, the right to housing, the ethical and political imperative around our housing policy and our housing provision, the idea of the right to housing, the issue of climate change, the threat of sea level rise, the necessity for managed retreat for some communities and the policies involved there. And of course, the issue of carbon footprint and the decarbonization of construction, including housing, and reducing the carbon footprint of our housing. And on that latter topic, Meta led the research group, included a number of people in the consortium, Francis Huppert, Chris Cirillo, Vren Brambat, Jared Delane, Zara Kuz, Richard Lee, Radi Majmudur, Dylan Baker-Rice, and EJ Song, some of whom I think are going to be on the call today. And in late 2021, we published a white paper policy on all of these issues. And I will put a link to it in the chat later in the talk. So obviously a major chapter is the chapter on decarbonization, and that's the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And of course, although we talk a lot about cars and car emissions, we all know that buildings are a lot worse. And one of the major recommendations of the white paper was the idea of adaptive reuse. You know, keeping an existing building is always more sustainable than demolition and reconstruction. So pay attention, please, the people that are doing the Penn Station GPP, knocking down some perfectly good buildings that could be kept. But on the other hand, we've got $56 billion in new construction every year in New York City. So addressing that issue will contribute substantially to reducing our carbon footprint in the future. And the recommendations coming out of the white paper focused on, among other things, strengthening the building codes. We know about Local Law 97, which is a kind of relatively little understood law that imposes pretty strict carbon emission standards on buildings over 25,000 square feet. And there are certain targets for 2025, 2030, 2050 to meet those requirements, and non-compliance will result in fines. And the white paper has some specific recommendations about strengthening Local Law 97 and making sure that we can achieve compliance. And then, of course, the issue of the extensive use of steel and concrete, very energy-hungry materials in new construction, and the idea of mass timber, and why in other parts of the world, like Canada and Scandinavia, mass timber in high-rise construction is now an accepted form of doing business and a more sustainable method. We don't seem to have gotten there yet in New York City, and we can and we should. So those are some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. I'm really looking forward to some of the contribution from the speakers, and I will hand it back to you, Meta. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was excellent. I would like to let everyone know that I'm joined by my co-moderator, Fatou Jabbie. Let me briefly tell you about Fatou. Fatou is a sustainability consultant and senior account manager at the New York City Accelerator. She provides technical advice at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice's New York City Accelerator program, collaboratively working with building owners, decision makers, and their teams to comply with local laws and implement cost-effective deep energy retrofits and smart technologies in buildings. She holds a Master of Science in Sustainability Management from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from Kentucky State University. Welcome, Fatou. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I have. Thank you so much for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm also very excited to be co-moderating this symposium with Meta, and I'm going to share a little bit of a background on her as well. Meta Brunzema is an architect and urban designer committed to sustainability, equity, and design justice. She practices architecture with the Collective for Community, Culture and Environment LLC, an all-women-owned consultancy based here in New York City. Meta is an adjunct professor, associate professor at Pratt Institute, where she leads the Pratt Housing Consortium Decarbonization Working Group. She holds a Master's of Architecture degree from Columbia University. I'll pass it back to you, Meta.
Thank you, Fatou. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Bill Caplan. Bill Caplan is the author of Thwart, Climate Change Now, Reducing Embodied Carbon Brick by Brick, and this book was published in 2021. With an engineer's understanding of sustainability, a passion for people-friendly building design, and a 34 career in high technology, Bill Caplan researched the building environment from a human and environmental perspective for more than a decade, contrasting designers' claims with the ecological veracity. Bill holds a Master of Architecture degree from Pratt School of Architecture and a Bachelor of Science in Materials Engineering from Cornell University. Let me now share my screen and we will hear Bill Caplan.
Thank you, Meta. There we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. It's great to be back at Pratt, even if only virtually. Welcome to the Decarbonization Symposium. Before we begin, I'd like to thank President Bronet and David Burney and for shining light on the urgent need for decarbonization. And thank you and Pratt's House about carbon emissions and the meaning of decarbonization. Slide, please. There we go, that's it. In the early 1900s, for the first time in over 300,000 years, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere exceeded 300 parts per million, that's ppm. Slide, please. Here we are 100 years later, and atmospheric carbon has reached 420 parts per million. 116 added since 1922. Next slide, please. In the 100 years prior to 1722, the increase was minuscule, just 2 parts per million. That was followed by a mere 7 through 1822. There was a slight uptick after the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, adding a total of 20 parts per million through 1922. But then it accelerated with an increase of 116 parts per million, reaching 420 this month. 100 parts per million were added in just the last 60 years at a rate we now know to be alarming. And with it, global warming followed suit, which we now know is its effect. Slide, please. Meta? Yeah. It was also 60 years ago in her book, Silent Spring, that Rachel Carson stated so presciently, the most alarming of man's assaults upon the environment is the contamination of the air, earth, rivers, and sea. That was 1962, and Silent Spring became a catalyst for the modern environmental movement. Its release spawned grassroots activities across the country, a new awakening that led to the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. This year marks the 60th anniversary of Silent Spring, and today marks the 52nd anniversary of Earth Day. Yet to this very day, we continue to assault our environment. Rachel Carson was referring to the massive use of pesticides. She noted the irony that man might determine his own future by something so seemingly trivial as the choice of an insect spray. Today, something so seemingly trivial as the choice of a building material might determine our future, or as trivial as a material aesthetic. Next slide, please. An aesthetic such as this one, concrete, for an architecture school, no less. The Architect's newspaper reported that the design was meant to be a teaching tool to inspire future architects, to showcase the basics of modern construction and sustainability. The building is even LEED certified, conveying an aura of sustainable design. Slide, please. To be fair, the design addresses the sun's position during the hottest months with a 25-foot roof extension to shade its glass facade. It's true, I'm sorry, next slide. It's true that the mass of the concrete helps to maintain interior temperatures under a hot sun. The 25-foot overhang in Florida's climate may well be a valid sustainability appendage, but not when constructed from concrete, including the entire roof and some of the walls. Sustainable design features do not negate nor justify carbon emissions from the excessive use of concrete, emitted in bulk before the first student entered. This is not unique to the University of Miami School of Architecture. Many architecture schools, as well as institutional, commercial, and residential ventures, are styled with a concrete aesthetic. Did we forget that manufacturing cement produces 7 to 8% of the world's energy-related carbon emissions? This is the opposite of decarbonization. It's time to wake up. Next slide, please. This is what global warming looks like, what we are facing. For the 2,000 years prior to 1900, temperatures remained within a plus or minus quarter degree bandwidth. But since 1900, they have increased more than 1 degree Celsius. Notice the sharp rise since 1970, and nearly half a degree change since 2000. If this rate of increase is not curtailed, holding to even a 3 degree rise. To slow down this rate of increase, we must decarbonize. But what does decarbonization actually mean? Next slide, please. When we speak about reducing emissions, energy and its consumption typically come to mind. This means switching to low carbon and no carbon sources and reducing the amount of energy we consume. Although achieving carbon-free energy worldwide is the ultimate solve-all, it is a very long-term proposition, one that requires political will, funding, and time. Slide, please. Reducing energy consumption relies on the use of energy-efficient appliances and designing energy-efficient buildings. Energy-efficient appliances and equipment are the low-hanging fruit, merely a function of budget and availability. This is not particularly taxing to an architect's design. Designing energy-efficient buildings or retrofits is a more difficult task. It is an art form that requires engineering finesse. But these solutions by themselves address only half the equation. They only address operating emissions. They ignore their own carbon footprint, the emissions generated while fabricating the materials and equipment, and those generated by constructing buildings and infrastructure. These are the embodied emissions. So how do these sources of carbon emissions, embodied and operating, relate to each other? Slide, please. That's simple. First, you mine, harvest, process, manufacture, transport, and assemble or construct. Then you get to use it. Embodied emissions are upfront.
The industry is clear-cutting woodlands that are an important...
Thank you. Embodied emissions are upfront. Operating emissions come later over time. Unfortunately, embodied emissions are released way before any product is purchased, before any building is occupied, before any infrastructure is used. They accelerate warming in real time, way before any benefit from energy efficiencies can even begin to accumulate. It can take a decade or more of operating gains to merely offset their upfront embodied emissions. As this graph indicates, over the next 5 years, 70% of the carbon emitted from new buildings will be embodied carbon. 10 years out, embodied emissions will still be the greatest share, equating to 60% of the total. Embodied emissions are the first tally of sustainability. Operating emissions are the second part of the equation, which brings us to the purpose of this seminar, to discuss the challenges and opportunities to decarbonize the built environment. Slide, please. Decarbonization is not just a good thing to do, like buying green, nor is it just an academic exercise in sustainable design. To understand the challenge and the opportunities to decarbonize, we need to know the facts. The facts matter. How many tons of carbon can we continue to emit before warming gets out of hand? How many tons are we emitting now? What is the status of our decarbonization? What is the timeline? The answers can be found in these two reports, Climate Change 2021 from the IPCC and the Emissions Gap Report from the UN Environment Program. The emissions allowable to stay within the 1.5 to 2 degree targets can be found in Climate Change 2021. Let's take a look. Next slide, please. This table addresses the remaining carbon budgets, the volume of carbon emissions allowable until net zero is achieved. Net zero means carbon emissions can be no higher than the amount of carbon freed from the atmosphere. Calculated from the beginning of 2020, each emissions allocation is tabulated with its likelihood for success from 17 to 83%. Given the consequences of continued warming, an 83% shot is the minimum we should shoot for. Would you bet the planet on anything less? To hold warming to 1.5 degrees with 83% probability allows 300 gigatons of additional CO2 emissions. That's cumulative from the beginning of 2020, 300 billion metric tons until we achieve net zero. Defaulting to the 2-degree target, we can triple that to 900 billion metric tons. That sounds like a big number, but how much do we actually emit each year? Slide, please. Maida? 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 Uh-oh.
I think she might be having issues. Let's just give her a few seconds.
Yeah, okay. Murphy and technology don't work well. So,
Letting her back in right now.
okay.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Can somebody enable the screen sharing, please?
Yes, give me one moment. Let's see.
Sorry about this interruption.
Okay, you should be able to do so now.
Okay. We are here. Can you all see the screen?
Is loading, but yes.
Okay, one more slide.
Okay. We're going to the next slide now, Bill?
Yes, yes, please. There we go. Okay. This is a graph of our annual CO2 emissions, the basis for calculating the carbon budget. Fossil CO2 emissions, bright purple, make up the bulk. The rest are from land use. Their total has exceeded 40 gigatons per year for nearly a decade. If we at least maintain this range, what's the prognosis? Slide, please. At 40 gigatons per year, we will exceed the remaining 300 gigaton budget for 1.5 degrees in 2027, only 5 years from now. And with it, our 80% chance of success. We will exceed the 900 gigaton budget for 2 degrees in 2042. Yet net zero targets from the world's largest emitters are 2050, 60, and 70 at best. So let's see how our transition to carbon-free energy from renewables is coming along. Slide, please. When it comes to renewables, like solar and wind, and for electrification, we are fed a lot of hyperbole about record growth, but numbers without context can be deceiving. Let's start with electrification. 26% of the global electricity consumed in 2019 was generated from renewables. 26% is fantastic progress, but here's the catch. Next slide, please. Electricity accounted for only 17% of total final energy consumption worldwide. In other words, electricity from renewables was 26% of that 17% share, a mere 4.4% of the total energy consumed worldwide. Slide, please. It's a similar story for heat as well as transportation from renewables. In 2019, total energy consumption from renewables worldwide was only 10.7%. But unfortunately, one of those renewables is not carbon-free, biomass. Next slide. It may surprise you that biomass is the largest source for renewable energy. Biomass fueled 40% of all renewable energy in the United States in 2019. Per BTU of energy released, biomass carbon emissions are actually worse than oil. and they're 40% greater than natural gas. Biomass energy generated 350 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in the US alone in 2019. Biomass energy consumption was twice hydro, twice wind, and 5.5 times solar. So how much of our energy is really generated from carbon-free renewables? Next slide, please. Total carbon-free energy generated in the United States in 2019 constituted 14.9% of energy consumption. But 57% of that was from nuclear. Carbon-free renewables constituted a mere 6.4% of total US energy consumption. While reducing emissions has been a priority for more than 20 years, we continue to look to the future, relying on the future decarbonization of our energy supply, on future electrification. Our journey to net zero will take a lot longer than advertised. We are not well on the way to decarbonization. Slide, please. In every other area of potential decarbonization, we are not doing enough. Regardless of all the green certifications, fawning articles in the press, and architecture competition award winners, with 40% of all energy-related emissions worldwide coming from the construction and operation of our built environment, we cannot wait for future decarbonization, a time frame based on wishful thinking. We must step up to the plate. Next slide, please. This is why I spent the last 3 years writing Thwart Climate Change Now, Reducing Embodied Carbon Brick by Brick. Embodied emissions from construction materials and design methodologies have altered the picture, altered the nature of the challenge. They must be factored in framing every policy and incentive, even for materials and products manufactured elsewhere. Climate change knows no borders. CO2 emitted elsewhere impacts the climate in New York. Slide, please. Now means over the next 5 years, 2022 to 2027. This is key to make over the next 10. We must buy time now by focusing on embodied emissions, by not taking them for granted as a necessary fact of life. Operating savings can depend on the weather, the economy, good practices, or the occupant's functional choices. They can also be improved upon in future years. This is not so with embodied emissions, which are locked in up front. Already emitted, they cannot be mitigated. Reducing new embodied emissions can be addressed immediately with the next building or infrastructure designed. There are two paths to cutting embodied emissions: top down and bottom up. Top down are through policy, legislation, and building codes, like New York City's Local Law 97. Bottom up is through the material choices of the 1.3 million architects worldwide, like using wood or low carbon products. Both paths are essential. But while we wait for the new building codes, policies, and legislation to be activated, architects worldwide can start cutting new emissions this year by something so seemingly trivial as material choice. If you are a student, please mention this in seminar or studio. If you teach, please teach it. If you are in practice, please apply it. If you are a policymaker or a legislator, please weigh embodied carbon in every decision. If you are an activist, please push for it. I urge you to do so, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was an excellent presentation. I'm going to stop share right now. I would like to urge all of our listeners to note their questions and put them into the chat. We will be taking questions and fielding questions, so please, 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 during the presentations, write down your questions and put them into the chat. So let me share my screen here. 1 second. Hold on. Screen. Can you see, what do you see on your screen now?
We see the symposium backdrop.
Okay, sorry. Let's see if I can, okay. Do you see a screen with the Earth and a title?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Okay, I would like to now introduce our second panelist, Dr. Paul Crivella. Dr. Paul Crivella is an American civil engineer and professor at the State of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, called SUNY ESF. His research focuses on the areas of mass timber and bio-based products. His teaching focuses on the areas of sustainable construction and construction management. Paul holds agricultural engineering degrees, Bachelor of Science and M Engineering from Cornell University, and a PhD in Environmental and Resource Engineering from SUNY ESF. Paul, please start your presentation. Can you see the first slide of Paul's presentation?
Yes, we can. Meta, thank you so very much. And thank you all. I'd like to extend my thanks as well to the wonderful team at Pratt, Meta, Francis, all of the organizers of this event. I'm really pleased that we're able to join together and look at this issue from a number of different perspectives. So I'm pleased to bring a perspective today from the SUNY mission-driven institution for environmental stewardship, the College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. Our institution is working on a number of fronts to help New York State transition to a more sustainable future, including, in my work, a bio-based economy. All of this essentially helps us to integrate into the overall state plans from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in building ourselves a future that I think was pretty clearly laid out in Jim's presentation, is the future that we deserve as New Yorkers and we need to leave for our children. So with that, could I have the next slide, Meta? So let me talk a little bit now about how we view the future of carbon-based impacts of our construction practices. And those carbon-based impacts include carbon-based impacts for both new and existing buildings. And so I'd like to start the talk about what the future for existing buildings looks like with a brief description of the recent history, if you will, of mass timber. And so mass timber construction was a project that was taken on in the late 90s in Europe to help understand if the forest resource could become essentially the key source for the structural systems in the future buildings being built in Europe. But it really came into the public perception in North America with a rather iconic project that was done in 2009 in London by Andrew Wall of Wall Thistleton Architects. And it was called Stadthaus. And it was an 8-story building. And it addressed kind of the future of construction in a number of ways. Inherently, it addressed the future of construction in recognizing that it needs to be a future that includes carbon as a storage component in the buildings themselves. And so it was a mass timber building. On the right, you're looking at the inside of what are referred to as cross-laminated timber panels. The total construction was a set of cross-laminated timber panels that were manufactured and customized off-site and then brought and assembled to site. The assembly itself of the 8-story building structural system had a 27-day duration, and it required 4 carpenters working on site during the process. So not only did this building represent what was potentially the future of construction materials, but it also represented a significant change in terms of the fabrication and delivery of construction projects. And so with that, really across the AEC industries, people started to delve into and consider potentially what are the aspects of this new approach, this mass timber approach, that we can capitalize on as we think about our future construction trajectory. And so Meta, could I have the next slide, please? And so sure enough, it began to pop up in the popular press. There were a number of aspects of it that seemed to capture the public imagination. And Meta, you can go ahead and keep advancing, I think 6 more times. And so people who knew I was working in this began to say, hey, I've seen this in this publication and that publication. And sure enough, over and over and over, it seemed like popular opinion had moved to recognizing potentially there was going to be a different future for the way we built our buildings. And so the next slide shares that as well. And yes. And so this future essentially combined a number of attractive components for how our buildings were to be built. And so significantly, large corporations that had made commitments to sustainability recognized that part of that commitment to sustainability would include the way that their built environment impacts were controlled. And so next slide. And one more click. So in announcing its new corporate headquarters being built in Bentonville, Arkansas, Walmart not only made a commitment to actually using forest products as the materials for construction, but also helping develop a regional forest economy within the state of Arkansas and beyond. Next slide. For Microsoft's new headquarters, as they build out their campus in Sunnyvale, they've recognized that all of the buildings will contain mass timber. This is mass timber panels, you'll note, used in a hybrid system. But they recognize potentially the ecological benefits of using forestry products in that regard. Next slide, please. A software development company in Australia has decided that their commitment to net zero carbon will begin with building their next headquarters, having significant amounts of mass timber. And next slide. And so Adidas projects as well, their recent headquarters addition, recognizes that they're building their future with mass timber and it's coming in a regional basis. So as we can see, all of this indicates that mass timber has captured the public imagination. It's become the darling of the popular press. And what we'd like to do and ensure at ESF is that the future construction trajectory of using this material is done in a truly sustainable manner. And so with the next slide, we're going to begin to discuss exactly what that looks like. So this is a slide from a wonderful book in regard to using carbon capturing or sequestering materials in our construction put together. And so this shows a study that was done by the engineering firm Arup. And what it's showing on the left, you see an axis that indicates that the lines above the x-axis are times when the building construction process is emitting carbon. The line below the x-axis indicates times when the building construction process is able to capture carbon. And so there's a comparison here between an identical building, one built with a reinforced concrete structural system, and that's shown as the dotted line to the top. The other is the solid line below, which shows the potential carbon impact of a mass timber building. And so what I'd like to do is sort of take us through the steps here of the way the comparison plays out when we look at these two construction approaches. You'll notice all the way over on the left, the process of carbon sequestration. Next, Meta. During this growth phase in the forest, is a key principle that fundamental to considering the environmental benefits of mass timber construction is really understanding and being able to optimize the way that the carbon impacts of the forestry practices are done. You can see the huge drop or carbon sequestration that we get from that. To the right of that, you'll notice that both for reinforced concrete as well as mass timber, the lines begin to rise, but there is a more substantial rise in the case of the reinforced concrete building. So there's an additional benefit from mass timber construction, and that comes about due to the reduced carbon required for fabrication of the products as opposed to the carbon invested in creating Portland cement and the rest of the concrete components. We refer to the second advantage as substitution benefits. So sequestration, what happens in the forest, and then substitution, the change in processes, are both considered when we consider the overall impact of carbon processes. However, there's one other significant potential impact of this total approach. And so next, Meta, if you could give me 2 additional clicks. Okay. You'll note that there now appears a new dotted line in this process, and that's a mass timber building, but a mass timber building built where sustainable practices aren't followed. And you'll notice that the sequestration is nowhere near as significant as the baseline building, and the manufacturing doesn't provide as great additional benefits. And so we end up with a timber process, a delivered building that is no longer carbon negative, but rather the structural system, in fact, is not as beneficial as it could be. That difference is an important difference, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing to make sure that we're moving in the right direction in that regard. The blue oval on the right is the end of life. And so this is something that we believe is a significant opportunity as well. It was pretty clear from the layout of where we're headed in terms of carbon that it's not enough to just think about what we're doing initially with embodied carbon nor operational carbon. We really need to view the future that we're leaving for our next generations and ensure that we're leaving them the opportunity to continue to enjoy what we've been able to enjoy with the natural environment. So at ESF, for new construction, we focused very closely on this initial stage and this final stage for our current research. So with the next slide, I'll begin talking a little bit about what we're doing with that initial stage. So what is happening at a forest level, in particular, what's happening at a forest level when we think about our New York State or our regional conditions? And so you'll notice the graph on the right shows that there's actually a number of different carbon fluxes. The dark line that heads up off to the right and diagonally indicates that year over year, our forests are very effectively capturing and sequestering carbon in the biomass that's available. When harvest time comes, you'll notice that that sequestered carbon drops significantly as we remove it from the forest stand. There are residues that are left in the forest, and so you'll notice that darker green swoosh down to the right indicates that those sit on the forest floor and release carbon for a period of time. And then there's a period of time just after that during which the stand takes to recover. As the new seedlings are planted, forests begin to grow, the rate of carbon capture is not as rapid as the rate of carbon capture of a more mature forest. So to really understand our impact in the forest, we've got to begin to break down and understand sort of what is it that we're working with when we think about New York State forests. So over on the left, you'll see a couple important notes. In no case in New York State do we really have what we would call old growth timber remaining. The late 1800s, early 1900s saw New York State essentially denuded of forest land. We were down to less than 20% forest cover. From that time, we've recovered, and today we're up over 60% forest cover in the state. However, that has actually not been uniformly planted, and so we end up with a very interesting natural replacement activity in succession that results in forests that have mixed species of trees in the forest. We have both hardwoods and softwoods, and we have a wide variety of each of those. We also have stands that are not uniform in age. And so unlike forests in the far north of Canada and in the southeast of the United States, where there are large uniform age populations, our forests look very different. We've got mixtures of species, and we also have mixtures of age. harvesting from our forest is really going in and selecting individual trees on a basis to create these products. So next slide, please, Meta. So what does it look like when we begin to think critically about New York State forests? So we'll divide up the forest resource into both softwoods and hardwoods. And on the left, you see there's some descriptors of one of the most, or the most common softwood species in New York State forest, and that's eastern white pine. These trees actually were characteristic of distinguished New York State forest for centuries. The initial colonization of the United States included an interest by the British Navy in coming to the forests of the northern United States to harvest eastern white pine because of their size, stature, and their ability to be used effectively for creating masts for British warships. So what we're talking about here is a species that's been long established in this region. We've got over 10 billion board feet of this timber. And most importantly, under current harvesting practices, as each year we remove 1 unit of biomass from the forest, nature is replacing that annually with 2.6 units of additional growth. So we actually are currently using our forest in the exact manner shown on that previous graph, where year over year, they are effectively carbon capturing ecological systems. However, if you're to go out into the forest, you're not just looking at these white pines. There's a mixture of hardwoods as well. And we've selected 3 in particular that have been of interest for our research. The first is black locust, and you can see on the right there, black locust essentially has a range in the lower right. You'll notice that the eastern seaboard of the United States is shown, and there's an array of green and darker green circles. This indicates essentially the range of both eastern white pine as well as black locust. So it's not unusual to find both of these trees in that range. This was actually an introduced species in the northern forest, and we are looking at it because it has very unique properties potentially for making mass timber products. We're looking at a couple other as well. You may have heard that there is an invasive pest, the emerald ash borer, which is causing mortality among about 8% of the hardwoods, which is the percentage that ash trees represent in our hardwood forest. So we're losing those, and we're losing those quickly as the pest spreads across New York State. We want to provide a solution that recognizes that forest dynamic and takes advantage of that biomass potential. And then we're also working with red maple. And so red maple is shown as a hardwood, and you can see in the upper diagram on this slide, that blue area showing mixed ranges of hardwoods there. And so New York State is well endowed with a significant amount of hardwoods like red maple that could be used potentially for products as well. And so Meta, if you will head to the next slide. So to understand what we should be building with, we really want to take what the forest has given us essentially and make sure that we're using it appropriately. So these are micrographs of the cellular structure. On the left, you're looking at eastern white pine, and on the right, you're looking at black locust. Eastern white pine distinguishes itself as having one of the lowest densities of any of the softwood species. Black locust, on the other hand, has one of the highest densities of any of the hardwoods. And so what we've been doing with each of these species is putting together mass timber products that will optimize these performance characteristics. And so Meta, if you can give us the next slide. So traditionally, mass timber panels have been created using a process referred to as cross-lamination. And as you can see here, this requires layers of parallelly placed boards and then subsequent layers that are placed orthogonal or perpendicular to the lower layer. And so this is done typically with monoculture species. So this is done typically with softwoods that are harvested in an industrial fashion. And then using industrial thicknesses and supply chains, these products are currently what dominate the mass timber construction industry. If you'll go to the next slide, Meta. We've been looking at both cross-laminated timber as well as diagonal cross-laminated timber, or DCLT. And in this instance, what you'll note is that the subsequent layers are not all laid in a perpendicular fashion, but actually we're able to consider the properties of the material, both in terms of its strength and its dimensional stability, and shoot to optimize the way we're using the fiber in the final product to give ourselves improved performance over CLTs. And so just to help you all sort of wrap your heads around what that might look like, I'll just show you a quick video, Meta, if you would. And yes, so if this plays, you can see, okay, what you're looking at is panels that are made with hardwood, black locust, outer layers, outer lamina, and then inner lamina, diagonal lamina of softwoods. And we're showing that the performance of these panels actually exceeds by anywhere from 30 to about 60% the performance of current products on the market of equal thickness. So although we don't have today a large industry in New York State producing these products, we've been pleased to be able to show that New York State has the resources which can be harvested sustainably to produce products fit for the future use. And so with that, what I'll do then is just touch on a few. I think I'm running up toward the end of my time. I'll touch on just a few other efforts that we've got at BSF. So Meta, the next slide. So we've been looking at what will happen at end of life. And really there's a couple key things that we should be doing now with mass timber construction to assure that we've got the opportunity for end of life resurrection, as we'd like to call it. And so those include capturing the information during the design and construction phase. We want to ensure that the architects understand exactly what's available, the engineers know the material properties, and the builders understand the construction processes so that they can put together accurate bids when the time comes for deconstruction. We're incorporating biologically based structural health monitoring systems. So these are indicators made with biomaterials that will be able to show the structural history of the panel and ensure architects have confidence that it hasn't been damaged during its use. And then at end of life, we're developing methods to use automation, as we recognize the future will probably allow for less and less labor to be used. We're ensuring that automation will be able to be used efficiently for the separation and deconstruction of those materials. And so with that, that really wraps up our current work in regard to new construction. I'll just touch briefly. I think Gabrielle will be sharing quite a bit about the potential for renovating existing buildings. And so I'll share that we've been working on a project that's built around a bio-based retrofit cladding system. And so you'll note on the right, we've got a thin 1.5" CLT panel as a substrate, and then we've got a wood fiber insulation product overlaying that. And next slide. And so these panels can be fabricated at scale. And as you note in the diagram shown, okay, in the middle left, wood fiber insulation, a product commonly used in Europe and about to be produced regionally in the Northeast and Maine, starting in 2023. Wood fiber insulation is the only insulation product currently that is carbon negative throughout its manufacturing process. And so the panels, if you'll give us the next slide, provide all the functions of envelope. And then if you'll provide the next slide, Meta. Being a bio-based material, we're very concerned about its long-term durability. So unlike petrochemical products, this bio-based product has the potential to, when installed, offset 6 years of energy savings for the building. So the panel installed in the building will provide a year of energy savings for each year that it remains on the surface of the building, but the embodied carbon captured in the manufacture and application of the panels to the exterior surface of the building can provide an additional 6 years of energy savings for the building. So we want to ensure that potentially this path, if provided, will have long-term durability. And so we're moving toward mock-up scale production and modeling of this as we move ahead. And so with that, I think, I hope I've given you a pretty clear picture of how we're trying to work in concert with the forest and ensure that we're doing right by what nature has given us to work with as a building material that embodies carbon. I apologize. I think we'll have questions at the end if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yeah. And please, attendees, please write down your questions and put them into the chat as you think of them. Right now, I'd like to introduce our third panelist, Gabrielle Brainard. Gabrielle is a visiting associate professor at Pratt, undergraduate architecture, and principal of Fabric First, Architecture and Consulting PLLC. Her current project addressed the challenge of decarbonizing the built environment with a focus on the building envelope and the existing built context of New York City and state. Research projects include a feasibility study of high performance retrofits, multifamily housing in New York State funded by NYSERDA, and an architect's guide to envelope retrofits funded by the AIA Upjohn Research Initiative. She's a certified Passif House consultant, designer, and trainer. So let me just stop now. Can you see it?
Yes, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Meta, and thank you to Meta and the Housing Consortium for the invitation. I'm going to speak this morning briefly about a book project that I'm working on with my research partner, Nina Sharifi, who's at Syracuse, another contribution from a little further north in New York State. And so we're working on this book project that grew out of a 2019 AI Upjohn grant that we received to produce an envelope retrofit guide. And this is basically going to be a collection of case studies of successful retrofits with a focus on the details of the building envelope. Next slide.
Let's see. Yep.
So I'll go briefly over the project background and context, and then just share a couple of the case studies, which I think are all actually from New York City, from Brooklyn and Manhattan. So why envelopes? So first of all, we're architects. I'm a building envelope specialist, and we have a kind of inherent interest in envelopes and construction details. But we also felt like the existing conversation around retrofits, which has really gained steam, particularly in New York with the passage of Local 97, there was just a lot of conversation about mechanical systems, and that's understandable. Those feel a little bit easier to retrofit. Often they have equipment that can be, to some extent, plug and play. And dealing with the fabric of individual buildings, where each building is kind of a snowflake, just feels a lot harder. So we felt like there hadn't been enough conversation about these fabric upgrades. And one of the challenges is that if we are going to electrify mechanical systems, we have to do something to the fabric to reduce it, to basically deal with efficiency. Otherwise, we're going to be looking at putting in, hugely very large electrical systems trying to meet the same needs as our current fossil fuel based systems. And it's not, the math is kind of not really going to pencil out. So the fabric upgrades and the mechanical systems kind of have to go hand in hand. And we felt like this is a really great challenge to architects, and that there wasn't maybe a lot of capacity within our community of designers to actually tackle some of these projects. So that was sort of the goal of the that's the goal of the book, is to kind of spread that knowledge. Next slide. So this is probably of no surprise to this group. Buildings are a big part of energy use, particularly in a place like New York City. Our state has these very ambitious decarbonization goals. We say we're going to reduce energy use from buildings by 40% by 2030. That's really soon. And decarbonize by 2050. Most of the buildings that we're going to need to use to meet those goals already exist. So it's really critical that we address this existing fabric in order to, if we have any hope of achieving these targets. Next slide. There are a number of existing resources on retrofits. This is something that the DOE has been working on for a while through its Building America program. That program is really focused on single-family housing. When you look at those publications, they are very focused on spray foam as the solution. So it's it's starting to feel a little dated now that we're having a more sophisticated discussion about embodied carbon. But it's important to acknowledge all the research that has gone on there. There's a number of city and state NGOs, not just the excellent Beaks in New York, but also Mass Save in Massachusetts. There's some interesting efforts also in Maine, Nova Scotia, folks who are kind of pushing this on the policy level. Their recommendations tend to be more policy driven and less kind of the nuts and bolts of details that architects are interested in. And then there's a lot of material out there from industry, which is great, but we need to acknowledge that a lot of that is typically biased towards a particular system or typology that folks are trying to sell you. So for example, there's a great retrofit guide from particular group of insulation manufacturers, and every detail has the particular insulation that they're trying to market. So it's important to think about where the information is coming from, and our interest was into producing something that was basically not kind of sponsored content. Next slide. So our guide in this, one of our things that we're kind of hoping to emulate is this really excellent book by Alison Kwok, Don LeCorner, and Jan Fillinger for passive house details. This is for new construction, but the focus is really on producing these high quality, very clear drawings of architectural details, and we felt like doing something like that for retrofit could be potentially very useful. Next slide. So the way that we've organized our thinking around this is around housing typologies. And one of our observations is that, if we look at historical developments in the United States, we have a number of very similar typologies based on the materials that were available at the time that that many of our towns and cities were built. So we see that we have common building types ranging from Maine to Minnesota. And these are buildings that are at the vintage that they're, likely in need of retrofit. Many of them have probably been retrofitted or changed a little bit already. Next slide. And our thinking about typology, we kind of broke it down by structural material, vintage, and size. We did some research for NYSERDA, where we kind of went into this in more detail for New York State. But basically, we're looking at wood frame buildings, masonry buildings, and you can see that there's some differences, particularly when we get into post-war mass masonry or transitional masonry buildings, where we have very large developments of buildings that are all very similar, which is a really interesting opportunity for retrofit.
Lauren,
Next slide.
I thought you were scuba diving somewhere.
And then, it's really important to be cognizant of the building science implications of retrofitting, and I think this is one of the most challenging aspects. You can get into a lot of trouble if you create a highly insulated building without dealing with other aspects of building science, particularly air tightness and ventilation.
Oh, no.
So this is something that we're going to deal with on a case-by-case basis. In the book, it's sort of hard to address something as complex as building science as a kind of as a guide, but it's something that will be specific to each case study. Next slide. And the basic thinking of how do we affect these retrofits, you can kind of insulate on the inside, insulate on the outside, or do a little bit of both. And we're going to dive into the case studies and see some examples of these strategies. Next slide. So I'll go through a small, a medium, and a large, looking at wood frame, masonry, and also some combination of kind of brick and block, all from New York City. Next slide. So when we're dealing with these small wood frame homes, these are, as some of you might know, we actually have a number of these in Brooklyn. Next slide. The options are sort of to try to insulate inside between the studs, or to remove the cladding and apply insulation and air barrier to the exterior. Obviously, there's many different materials that you might consider for this. We're going to see an example using, I'm not sure if it's mineral or wood fiber. Next slide, please. So this is a case study from Ditmas Park by Duncan Architect. This is actually a historic district. The existing building dates from, I want to say, the 1920s. It actually ended up with asbestos shingle. Yeah, I believe this house was built between 1902 to 1914. Next slide. So the architect made the decision to retrofit this to Passive House standards and basically did a complete gut because there were other things that needed updating on the interior of the building. But they basically removed the cladding, installed new control layers and insulation, and then replaced the cladding and maintained the the appearance of the historic district, which can get a little bit challenging because if you're adding insulation on the outside, you're actually changing the geometry of the building itself. Next slide. Another example, this is a really interesting one of pre-war masonry. So New York City has a lot of mass masonry buildings, let's say 6 or 7 stories or less. Many of these are co-ops. This would also apply to row houses. Next slide. These strategies would also apply to row houses, but again, you kind of have the option of adding the insulation and air tightness on the interior or doing it on the exterior. Often in these brick buildings, putting it on the interior can be preferable to if there's ornament on the outside that you want to preserve. On the flip side, putting it on the exterior would help out if you've got really tight interior clearances where you need to maintain, minimum room sizes and that sort of thing. Next slide. This case study is again in Brooklyn, also in Ditmas Park, of a co-op, where the co-op actually had control over a couple of units that had been rentals, and one of those units was vacated, and they decided to do a kind of standalone Passive House level retrofit of this unit. So next slide. So basically, they basically encapsulated this unit. They insulated the interior of the brick wall, and they also put insulation and air tightness in the ceiling and the floor, which is great for sound insulation as well. Prior to adding the mineral wool insulation, they did a liquid applied air barrier on the brick. Next slide. And then this is kind of some construction photos, and then an interior vapor variable control layer and new mechanical system. So this particular unit now has its own ventilation, heating and cooling system separate from the building. Really interesting approach. It kind of gets at the challenges of what do you do in a co-op where you've got a lot of folks that are tenants or owners who are not easily moved or displaced during construction. You might have to do units one by one. Next slide. And the last example is a large, again, co-op concrete and masonry building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Next slide. So again, the choice to insulate either the interior or the exterior. Next slide. This particular building is being renovated by Rogers Partners, and they had a lot of issues with deteriorating brick. So they had brick falling off. It was an issue for FISP, formerly known as Local Law 11. They had kind of a permanent sidewalk bridge, and then Local Law 97 came along, and the co-op said, okay, we've really got to do something about this because this is not, sustainable financially for us. We need to stabilize this facade, and we need to deal with the potential fines that are coming down the road with Local Law 97. Next slide. So this is some issues of the deterioration of the brick. Next slide. A lot of these buildings unfortunately are poorly constructed, and we're kind of seeing the results of this, 50 years later, 60 years later. The co-op made the decision to remove the brick, essentially take it back to the concrete block, install exterior insulation and new cladding system. So it's basically a rain screen system. Next slide. And it's a ceramic tile rain screen. So they totally changed the look of the building, in addition to dealing with some of the issues they had with the facade deterioration. And interestingly, they didn't update the windows. They kind of did a very careful cost-benefit analysis of this because the cost was being borne by the building owners, the co-op members, many of whom were on fixed income. So I think this highlights some of the challenges also of, how do we actually retrofit these large projects and how do we finance it? Because a lot of folks are not in these co-op buildings in particular are not, planning on these major renovations as part of their capital plans. Next slide. So just a kind of a teaser, this is a project that a lot of you may be aware of that's just started to be publicized by Cycle Architecture and Planning that was funded by NYSERDA to do large-scale retrofits of NYCHA projects. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of examples of not just in public housing, but also in the private sector of these really large campuses where there's multiple buildings, often mass masonry with repetitive construction. And they are a great candidate potentially for an exterior retrofit that doesn't displace the residents. And one of the things that Cycle Architecture is looking at is, can we also use that as an architectural opportunity to actually change the look and the appearance of these buildings? So I don't have details. This is something that will definitely be included in the book, but I just put a rendering here to kind of, as a bit of a teaser to have people think of some of the potentially inspirational potential of retrofits in New York. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. That was fascinating. So as you may have heard, we have scheduled a short break after Gabrielle's presentation. So I would like to shorten that break to maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Hey, Jerry, congrats.
So please just go and get yourself a cup of coffee or water, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes. Okay, thank you.